Welcome back. We are having our discussion about Spiritwind again today. Now, Spiritwind is a study group for spiritual adventurers, and we ask everyone to join us, come along on the ride with us. I'm Pam Hart, and I'm the co-host, and our other presenter today is Rick Reich, and we're going to be talking today about Meister Eckhart. And we were talking about him for the month of November. So let's hear a little bit about what happened in the month of November with Meister Eckhart.
Sure. Meister Eckhart, as we learned last month and as we studied this month, was a 13th century mystic, prophet, a feminist, a philosopher, a preacher, a theologian, a teacher, a spiritual genius, you might say, who ended up being unjustly accused of heresy. He preached in the language of the people, and while Hindus, such as Kumara Swami, the Hindu Ananda Kumara Swami, wrote about him and studied him, and then the Buddhist D.G. Suzuki also wrote about him in his book on Hinduism and Buddhist mysticism. And so they have claimed, Hindus and Buddhists have claimed him as their own, and yet we pointed out, and you probably yourself might not have ever heard of Meister Eckhart. So he's not known very widely among Christians. He lived during the time, just to give you an idea what was going on in the world at that time. In the West, you had King Henry III, King of England was reigning at the time, but Kublai Khan, the Mongol, was also terrorizing the whole continent, and Marco Polo was during that time, and also Joan of Arc was during that time.
Well, a couple of things you said there. Now, first of all, you listed all his attributes, and that kind of sounds like another polymath. Yes. We were talking about polymaths before, of these philosophers that just were able to do all this math and science and,
right.
and everything. And it sounds like Meister Eckhart was another one of these.
He was, and he would have been a student 100 years earlier of was Hildegard of Bingen, who was also a polymath, and I'm sure he knew of her as well.
And one of the other things that you said was that he spoke in the language of the people.
Right.
And so that meant that he spoke in whatever language country he was in. He was not speaking in Latin, in other words.
Right.
So he kind of went against the church as far as that's concerned.
Right, because Latin was the language of the faith at that time. It was good, it served a good purpose and a bad purpose. The good purpose was, if that was the only language spoken, that meant that no matter what country you were in, if you knew Latin, you could know what was going on in the service. The bad part was, more than often, people in different little countries that never learned any language but their own particular dialect, and in this case, Meister Eckhart was a pastor of a German church, and the dialect was, German wasn't even formalized as it is today at that point, but the form of the dialect of what would become German was the language that these people spoke, and he spoke to them in their language so they could understand what he was saying. And that did kind of rub the church the wrong way. But anyway, and we actually ended up spending a whole night just looking at 3 of his sermons in those times that he preached in those days, and we noted how unusual his sermons were, and in fact the class kind of concluded that you'd have to be a mystic to understand him in the first place. But Eckhart said, theologians may quarrel, but the mystics of the world speak one language.
Interesting. And that's why he appealed to the Buddhists and the Hindus.
Right.
And so forth. They understood what he was
Exactly.
saying. Well, that's interesting. And then you also mentioned that he was a feminist?
Right. And most people don't think of the feminists back in the 13th century, but there was a 13th century women's movement. It was called the Beguines. And what happened, and this was in the different countries like France and Spain and England even, and the Beguines were in that century. And what was unusual about them was in that country, in those countries in those days, during the Holy Roman Empire and so forth, a woman only had two options. She could be a wife and mother, or she could be a nun. That's it. The other options you didn't want to even think about that there were. But they created a third option, and that was to become a Beguine. And the Beguines were a community of women, almost like a commune, where they had blacksmiths and weavers and all different people in a whole community, but they're women. And of course, the fact that they existed without men and without the ecclesiastical hierarchy, without their approval, was always, they were considered heretics.
Oh.
They were considered heretics, but Meister Eckhart always stood up for them. And it's very interesting, the Beguines by and large lasted from the 1200s, which was, when Meister Eckhart was, all the way up to the 1600s. So nearly 400 years they lasted. But even besides that, the passing away of the last Beguine was in 2013. And it was a woman by the name of Marcella Patton.
Wow.
Yeah.
So a little core group existed
Just
over the
still-
centuries.
Yeah. But mainly it was those 400 years from the 1200s to 600s, yeah.
Yeah, I guess they would die out if they didn't have any interactions with men.
Yeah. Right, eventually.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, what else did we do in class?
Well, one night we looked at creation, the writings of Meister Eckhart on creation spirituality in view of the four paths of creation spirituality, which are the via positiva, the via negativa, via creativa, and the via transformativa. And those four paths have been superimposed upon Eckhart's writings.
So he isn't the one who came up with those four paths.
Matthew Fox in reading, and he's one of the main translators of Eckhart from both the Latin and the German. And he, from reading all those things, has seized those four paths in his writings.
Kind of to categorize Eckhart's writings into those areas.
Yeah, he's done that. And then the next evening that we met, we looked at the relationship of Eckhart to Carl Jung.
Oh, Well, they weren't in the same century, though.
No, they weren't. Carl Jung lived from 1875 to 1961, but in it, and in fact we're still going to do that tomorrow night. That'll be the last in the series on Eckhart tomorrow night, and we're going to look at. There are a lot of things that Carl Jung himself said that he wouldn't have had the spiritual depth that he had without his understanding of Eckhart. So Jung himself was a student of Eckhart, and we're going to, like tomorrow night, look at how he influenced Jung and kind of kept him, because one thing a lot of people don't know is that Carl Jung suffered from severe depression, and at one point he had a complete psychic break that lasted for over 2 years.
Oh.
Yeah. So, and during that time, Eckhart was kind of like an anchor for him, you know. So that's what we'll be looking at.
Did you have some other readings of Eckhart that we might look at?
Yeah, I just had a few quotes I wanted to share, kind of to wrap things up. This is my one of my very favorite. He says, Meister Eckhart says, every creature is a word of God. If I spent enough time with the tiniest creature, even a caterpillar, I'd never have to prepare a sermon so full of God as every creature. So you see, he's very creation-oriented in the things he writes about. Like this: everything which God created millions of years ago, and everything which will be created by God after millions of years, if the world endures until then, God is creating all that in the innermost depths and realms of the soul. Everything of the past, everything of the present, everything of the future, God creates in the innermost realms of the soul. So that's a bit of his more mystical writings. This is one that is even on Hallmark cards. People never heard, and when they read it, they never knew that Eckhart was the author of it.
And they don't attribute it to him either.
No, but he's the one that wrote it. It's if the only prayer you pray in your entire life is thank you, that would suffice.
Well, I see now why we had Meister Eckhart as our topic for this Thanksgiving season, because we can just say thank you.
Yeah. And just one last one. This just shows how this is like what a minister might say to his congregation, maybe in a stewardship sermon or something. But here's Eckhart. He says, some people, I swear, want to love God in the same way as they love a cow. They love it for its milk and cheese and the profit they will derive from it. Those who love God for the sake of outward riches or for the sake of inward consolation operate on the same principle. They're not loving God correctly. They are merely loving for their own advantage.
So he pointed out hard truths.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that wraps up Meister Eckhart. And so now we have a new topic that we're going to be exploring in December. And that is the Proto Gospel of James. So first of all, proto means before.
Right.
Kind of the Gospels that came, the Gospel that came before the other Gospel.
So what we're studying for December is the Proto-Gospel of James. Its real title is the Proto-Evangelium of James. Euangelion is the Greek word for gospel. And so Proto-Evangelum is a English version of Evangelion. But it means it's supposedly meaning what happened before the actual gospel.
But this wasn't in the Bible.
No, it wasn't in the Bible. They believe it was written in the 2nd century, which is still very close to the time. The other Gospels are believed to have all been written in the 1st century, with John being the last writer around 100 A.D. But anyway, it's in the 2nd century, so it's still close, and it shows a very well. I'll talk about that a little later. From a historical perspective, it's a very important thing to look at for a number of reasons. First, it was written and it uses the Gospel of Matthew and Luke similar to the way that Matthew and Luke used Mark. See, both Luke and Matthew used Mark to put together their Gospels and added their own material. And in the Proto-Gospel of James, he uses both information from Matthew and Luke and then adds his own material. The book itself claims to be written by James, the brother of Jesus, and it is assumed that James, because of what people believe about Christ as being incarnate God, they believe that James was actually the son of Joseph from its previous marriage.
Oh, okay.
Like Joseph was a widower, so they were actually half brothers.
Right.
I don't know how.
Kind of.
Yeah. Anyway, and the second reason it's very popular is it tells us of things that happened before the birth of Jesus, such as the birth of Mary. And then when it talks about the birth of Jesus, it adds some kind of strange elements that aren't in the other Gospels.
The birth of Mary. Now that sounds interesting. I don't think we have heard about that in other Gospels, have we?
No. In fact, the Gospels, at least Matthew and Luke, start with the birth of, John the Baptist, who came before Jesus, and then at least in Luke, and then Mary goes to visit Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. And that's very important in this story, because the story of Zachariah and Elizabeth, who are the parents of John the Baptist in the Gospel of Luke, were in a situation where they wanted to have a child very badly. And in fact, to not be able to have a child, which they called to be barren, was like almost a curse of God. It was like to be cursed. And to be barren, is no seed will grow, is the image of that. So anyway, this was the exact same situation that Mary's parents were in.
Oh.
Their names was Joachim and Anna. And Joachim and Anna were not able to have a child. And they prayed and prayed and prayed that God would give them a child, not only like Elizabeth and Zachariah, but Abraham and Sarah, the founders of the faith. They had the same problem too. And so anyway, and she promises that if they give them a child, they will dedicate the child to the temple.
Oh.
So what happens is, lo and behold, they don't have a boy. They have a girl.
Oh.
And it's Mary. So they keep her till she's 3 years old. And when she's 3 years old, she's turned over to the temple.
Oh. Wow.
She works in the temple. And, it doesn't tell us what she does, except it does say she is a seamstress for the curtain in the temple. In the temple, there is the most holy place that behind it was the Ark of the Covenant, and it was a curtain that separated it. And it said she was a seamstress that worked on the curtain.
Oh.
So we know she did that kind of work, but she probably cleaned too and did other things. Anyway, she lived there until she was 12 years old. And at 12 years old, that's when a girl reaches her bat mitzvah, which means her coming of age, becoming a daughter of the law. And that time she has to leave the temple, because she's too old to be there anymore. And at that point, Joseph enters the picture, and he's assigned to be her guardian. And then it goes on to tell about the birth of Jesus in a somewhat unusual way.
So Mary is only 12 years old when she's given to Joseph.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
see, in those days, and I think in some cultures today still, the sign that a woman is old enough to marry is when she begins to menstruate.
right, yeah.
And so, that's why the bat mitzvah is at 12, Anyway.
Okay, well, Mary had a very interesting upbringing then, and I'm really surprised to hear that women were allowed in the temple, but I can see she wasn't a woman. She was just a child and a servant of the temple.
A servant of the temple.
And so, can you tell us a little bit about what the gospel actually tells us, other than the birth of Mary?
Well, just a short outline of the actual book. It says that first it talks about the birth of Mary, but it starts with the prayers and so forth of Joachim and Anna when they're praying for the birth of
a child.
Then we're told that she's brought up in the temple. Her work as being a seamstress for the temple curtain. Her marriage of Joseph at 12, and then the birth of Jesus in a cave outside of Bethlehem.
A little bit different than...
Now, so the birth story is very dependent on Matthew and Luke, in that they have them in Bethlehem, at least outside of Bethlehem, in a cave. And also different, in our Gospels, meaning Matthew and Luke, it just says the child was born. Okay?
That's it.
That's it.
Yeah.
But this Gospel, the Proto Gospel of James, says how it happened. It adds, and I'll show you what I mean.
Physical description.
Almost. It starts with she's goes into labor, and she's in this cave, and Joseph leaves her there to go get a midwife.
Oh, okay.
See, there's no midwife in the other stories.
Right.
So he goes to get a midwife, and he brings the midwife back, and she's about ready to give birth to the baby, and she gives birth to the baby. Jesus, of course, and then a kind of strange thing happens where the woman wants to make sure that she's still a virgin.
The midwife wants to make sure?
Yeah.
Even after the birth of a baby?
Right, that's why she wants to make sure.
Oh. Okay.
Because you would think it wouldn't be.
Right.
And yet, first of all, she finds out that she is still a virgin, and secondly, she gets kind of cursed by God and
For doubting?
for doubting, and then she has to repent and all this stuff.
Oh, my goodness.
For doubting.
Uh-huh.
So it's very kind of an unusual story how they put it. And what's interesting is that this story is the basis of two very important doctrines. It's beyond doctrines, dogmas of the Catholic Church. One is the perpetual virginity of Mary,
Mm-hmm.
and the other is the Immaculate Conception. Oftentimes Christians confuse and they think the Immaculate Conception has to do with the birth of Jesus. But it does not. The Immaculate Conception is the Immaculate Conception of Mary. And the logic went, if Jesus is without original sin, then he couldn't be born from God and a woman with original sin.
Oh, okay.
So Mary had to be born miraculously without sin herself in order to give birth to its son
Okay.
without sin, which made her the only human being that's ever lived a perfect life.
And that's why
and
she's
without-
so revered in the Catholic
Yeah,
Church to this
in
day,
the-
too.
Yeah, and so what's the strange thing is that, like, at the various early church councils, they never included this book in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we know by the 2nd century they were already using it because it circulated.
Oh,
That's why we found,
Yeah, copies of it,
copies
yeah.
of it and stuff.
Uh-huh.
And so, but by the 5th century, Pope Gelasius in 496 decreed that that this book was false. It was
heresy or
not that it was heresy. It was apocryphal.
okay.
And apocryphal meant it wasn't real. It was written by someone that was making up that they were James, and it wasn't a true story. It wasn't of God. Mm-hmm. And then what's interesting is that was in 496 when he died, that pope. But then Pope Pius IX in 1954 made the Immaculate Conception a dogma of the Catholic Church, meaning it's infallible. It's an infallible truth. Mm-hmm.
Well, I can see now why we're going to study this proto-gospel of James in the month of December.
Yeah.
Because it has to do with Jesus' birth and so forth.
Yeah, it's kind of a Christmas story.
Exactly. So I'd like to invite everyone to come to our Spiritwind meetings, and we do meet every Wednesday, except for the Wednesday right before Thanksgiving, at 5:30 at Unity of Auburn, which is 1212 High Street. And come and join in the discussion. Learn something new. There's no charge for this, and we'd love to have you come and visit us.
Yes.
Bring your ideas and challenge us. Thank you very much.